All it takes is black smoke rising from buildings once deemed untouchable. All it takes is firelight reflecting off the sky, and streets once accustomed to silence, suddenly swelling with people. Iran is entering such a moment. What you're about to hear isn't sensational news, nor is it a story recycled from official statements. This is a mosaic pieced together from leaked images, buried facts, and geopolitical calculations few dare to speak aloud. If you want to understand what's really happening behind the black curtain in Tehran and why it could shake the entire Middle East, stay with us until the end of this video. And if you value analysis that goes straight to the heart of power, don't forget to subscribe so we don't miss these unfolding moments of history. There are moments in history when power doesn't collapse because of a coup or an ultimatum from the outside, but because of something profoundly human. The moment fear is no longer strong enough to keep people silent. Iran is stepping into that very moment. On January 17th, when the Tehran government declared martial law, cut internet access, and reassured the public that everything was under control, they believed that pulling down the familiar black curtain would be enough. For decades, that formula had worked. Darkness to conceal, violence to silence, and time to make people forget. But this time, the darkness wasn't absolute. Just hours later, leaked images tore through the carefully staged script. Tehran wasn't silent. Tehran was on fire. Black smoke curled upward from buildings once believed to be invulnerable. Flames lit up streets long accustomed to submission. And the crowd, no longer scattered groups chanting then fading away, was now a deliberate force, moving with purpose, knowing exactly what they were aiming for. In that moment, the story was no longer about unrest. It was about the collapse of a psychological order that had lasted over 40 years. The greatest threat to any regime isn't the sound of angry voices, it's the shift in how people perceive power. When a bank is set ablaze, it's not just the destruction of property, it's the burning of trust. When the tax office is engulfed in smoke, it's not just sabotage, it's a rejection of the state's legitimacy. And when propaganda centers, the symbols of information control, are attacked, it's a clear sign that people no longer believe the story they've been forced to hear every day. In Iran right now, people aren't asking, are we allowed to protest? They're asking, where is the system's weak point? That's the razor-thin but deadly line between resistance and confrontation. And once that line is crossed, every claim of stability becomes meaningless. This video does not aim to incite nor to glorify violence. What it does, and what must be said plainly, is to confront the truth of the moment unfolding before us. Because when fire erupts from within, it's no longer the story of scattered demonstrations. It becomes a process, a chain reaction, where each step forward is more dangerous than the last. And right here, the biggest question begins to emerge. What happens when rage no longer seeks to be heard, but instead begins to paralyze the very system that represses it? When the target is no longer the square, but the bank, the tax office, the broadcast station, and the core links of the state's machinery? From the moment that black curtain was torn open, Iran entered a different phase. No longer mere protest, no longer emotional waves that surge and recede. What's taking shape now is a new kind of conflict, quiet, calculated, where cities become battlegrounds and infrastructure becomes the target. And to understand why this terrifies Tehran more than any chant ever could, we have to look deeper into this dangerous transformation, from protest to infrastructure warfare. When a resistance movement enters its most dangerous phase, what changes isn't the number of people on the streets, it's the way they see the space around them. The streets are no longer just places to gather, to chant, to disperse into the night. They become a tactical map. Every building, every power station, every administrative office begins to take on new meaning. And in Iran, this transformation is happening at a speed that even seasoned veterans of street violence are wary of. For decades, the Iranian state has learned how to manage protests. It allowed public anger within a confined space and time frame, as long as the core machinery of governance remained untouched. Police could crack down, militias could disperse crowds, the internet could be shut off, but the treasury kept running, taxes kept flowing, salaries kept being paid, and state media kept broadcasting the same narrative. That's how the regime weathered wave after wave of discontent. But this time, the crowd isn't playing by the old rules. When Ayanda Bank went up in flames, it wasn't a spontaneous outburst of rage. To many Iranians, that bank isn't just a place to deposit money. It's a symbol of a financial system they believe has long betrayed them, where the value of hard-earned wages is eaten away by inflation, siphoned off by corruption, and protected by an elite class detached from reality. So the fire didn't just consume concrete and paper, it struck at the collective financial memory of society, at the belief that this system is even worth preserving. In economics, a bank run is seen as a psychological phenomenon. But in Tehran, despair has gone far beyond psychology. When trust collapses, people don't just withdraw their money, they erase the symbols of injustice. And when that happens across multiple sites in a city, the message becomes crystal clear. This is not chaotic disorder. This is intentional rejection. The same logic is playing out at tax offices. To the state, taxes are lifeblood. To the people, they're a burden, made all the more senseless when the return is only repression and lies. When tax buildings are targeted, it's a direct strike at the regime's ability to sustain itself. No tax revenue means the state can't fund its enforcement apparatus. No cash flow means violence becomes more expensive than ever. At the same time, the propaganda machine is being attacked. Broadcast towers, state-run media stations, engulfed in flames under the night sky, send a message of deep symbolism. For years, Tehran's power didn't rest solely in batons or bullets. It lay in its ability to shape reality through the screen. When people burn these symbols, they're not just destroying equipment, they're declaring they no longer accept the version of truth being imposed on them. At this point, a line has been crossed. The movement is no longer trying to be heard, it's trying to paralyze. This is the essence of urban infrastructure warfare. You don't need to seize territory or take over government buildings. You just need to make the system fragile, costly, and full of risk. Every fire becomes a question for the state. How many links in the chain are still under your control? In this context, fear, the greatest asset of any authoritarian regime, begins to falter. When people realize that attacking infrastructure doesn't lead to their immediate downfall, but instead exposes the regime's confusion, public psychology shifts fast. Caution gives way to boldness, and boldness in an environment long under repression spreads faster than any slogan ever could. It's at this point that a particularly symbolic target comes into focus. Not a bank, not a tax office, not a broadcast station, but the ultimate symbol of fear, repression, and the cost of defiance. A place that, if struck, would shake the psychological foundations of the entire regime. When the crowd starts looking toward the besieged headquarters, it's no longer the next step in a protest. It's a dangerous leap forward. Because from that moment on, the conflict isn't just about disabling the system. It's about breaking the one thing that's held it together for decades, the circle of fear. And when that circle is publicly challenged, every traditional mechanism of control becomes meaningless. There are symbols of power that don't need to appear on television, don't need speeches, don't need a flag waving in the air. They exist through the silence they impose. Besiege is one such symbol. For over 4 decades, that name has been synonymous with a pervasive fear woven into the daily life of Iranians. It didn't always require open repression. It was enough that people knew besiege was there, that it could appear at any moment, and that the price of defiance was always greater than what any single individual could bear. That's why the moment when besieged headquarters were overrun by civilians carried meaning far beyond a street clash. It wasn't merely the fall of a building. It was the collapse of a psychological structure. Footage spreading across networks showed a crowd no longer avoiding, no longer hesitating. They surrounded, broke in, set fire, and most crucially, they freed those who had been imprisoned for daring to challenge the regime. In that instant, the roles reversed. The oppressed became the force, and the oppressors the ones on the defensive. Not through heavy weaponry, not through sophisticated tactics, but through something far more dangerous, the belief that fear could be defeated. In every authoritarian system, fear is the most strategic asset. It's cheaper than bullets, stronger than steel fences, and more effective than any emergency decree. As long as people believe resistance will always lead to ruin, a regime can survive, even amid economic collapse and the erosion of legitimacy. But once that belief breaks, the entire structure of power begins to shake from within. Basij's failure to hold its own headquarters sent a chilling message through society. Those once considered untouchable could fall. And that message spreads faster than any hashtag ever could. It moves through glances, through whispered stories, through a visceral sense that they're not as strong as we thought. At this point, the issue is no longer how many besieged facilities are attacked. It's the psychological chain reaction. When one symbol of fear collapses, the others become fragile in turn. Security forces elsewhere begin to hesitate. The chain of command is no longer followed with the same certainty. Loyalty, once built on privilege and fear, starts to show cracks that can't easily be sealed. For the Tehran regime, this is the true nightmare. Because they understand that raw violence cannot recreate a fear that's already been broken. Each bullet fired now doesn't deter. It only confirms that power is being challenged. And the more force they use, the more they reveal that their once sophisticated tools of control no longer work. This is where a dangerous paradox emerges. As domestic security forces begin to waver, as Basij ceases to be a reliable psychological shield, the state is forced to look for harder hands. But those hands no longer come from within Iranian society. Reports are beginning to speak of forces appearing who don't speak the same language, who didn't grow up with the same collective memories, who have no family or social ties to the streets now in flames. That's the sign that the inner ring of control has been stretched to its limit. When a regime must rely on people who are not part of the community they are suppressing, that is no longer power. That is desperation in military disguise. And from that moment on, the conflict is no longer just between the state and its people. It begins to take on the shape of something far more dangerous, a sense of occupation. And that feeling is what will push the crisis into a new phase, a phase where violence is no longer just domestic, but imported from beyond. There is an invisible line every state tries not to cross. It's the moment they must admit, if not in words, then in action, that their internal apparatus of control is no longer strong enough to keep society within its old boundaries. When Iran began relying on foreign fighters to suppress its own people, that line was broken. OSINT reports and leaked sources now point to the growing presence of Shia militias from Iraq, the Afghan-origin Fatemiyun, and the Pakistani Zainabiyun forces. From a purely military standpoint, these are not weak names. They've fought in Syria, they're familiar with urban warfare, and they've been hardened by brutal, violent environments. But precisely because of that, their appearance on Iranian streets carries a deeply dangerous political meaning. Because they do not belong to this society. They don't speak the everyday language. They don't share the historical memory. They have no family living in the burning neighborhoods. They don't carry the social ties that might make an Iranian hesitate when facing their fellow citizens. And in an internal conflict, that makes them a cold, double-edged blade. To the regime, these foreign fighters are tools, filling the gap as domestic forces waver, as Basij is no longer feared enough to stand at the front lines. But to the people, the image of armed men speaking in foreign tongues, behaving like an occupying force, shatters the entire narrative of internal stability. From this moment on, the crisis is no longer perceived as repression from a state. It's felt as the intrusion of a foreign power into everyday life. Middle Eastern history shows there is no faster way to trigger a nationalist reflex than to bring in foreign fighters to suppress the population. That's when individual fear gives way to a collective sense that we are being treated like enemies on our own soil. And once that feeling takes root, the society's threshold for risk skyrockets. People stop calculating short-term consequences. They begin to act with the mindset of having nothing left to lose. Ironically, what Tehran hoped would restore control is now accelerating its loss. Foreign forces may be more brutal, but they cannot recreate the kind of social fear that Basij once commanded. That fear only worked when the oppressor was seen as part of the community, when punishment still carried the shape of internal discipline. But when the hand of repression becomes foreign, it no longer deters. It only deepens hatred. The presence of these forces also exposes a truth that can no longer be concealed. The regime has exhausted its political resources. When a state is forced to rely on actors with no social legitimacy to survive, it's a clear sign that whatever thread of consensus once existed, no matter how thin, is now gone. Power at that point is no longer based on acceptance. It's based purely on outsourced violence. And at a deeper level, these foreign forces serve as an unspoken confession of collapse of trust within the leadership itself. They no longer believe that calls for loyalty or speeches about order and morality can hold society together. They've chosen someone else's guns because that's the only thing they still believe might work. And yet, as Iran's streets increasingly resemble an occupied zone, the messages from those in power seem to come from a different world altogether. A world where everything is still under control, where violence is dressed in euphemisms, and where the burning reality outside is replaced with cold clinical words. This growing disconnect between what people are living and what their leaders are saying is what will lead to the next dangerous stage of the crisis, the complete collapse of the regime's narrative. There comes a moment in every crisis when violence is no longer the central issue. What becomes more dangerous is language. Not because words hold the power to suppress, but because they reveal an unbridgeable divide between those in power and the society they rule. Iran is in that moment now. While the streets of Tehran burn, while state buildings are attacked and foreign fighters roam residential neighborhoods, the messages coming from the top speak in a tone that feels worlds apart. In their version of reality, order is still intact. What's unfolding is merely isolated unrest, the work of enemies, a temporary challenge that will soon pass. These words are not just out of touch, they sound as if they were issued from a place where gunfire and screams can't be heard. The rupture of narrative begins right there. When people watch their friends and family get arrested, shot, even publicly hanged, yet leaders still call it a celebration, every final thread of trust is severed. Words, once tools to legitimize power, now serve as proof that this power no longer understands or no longer cares about the society it governs. History shows no regime collapses solely because of military defeat. They fall when the story they tell is no longer believed. In Iran, the official narrative has long lost its power to persuade, but now it has also lost its power to intimidate. Warnings of death sentences and brutal punishment no longer instill fear. On the contrary, they create martyrs. They create names that become symbols. They create collective memories that fuel long-term resistance. In the eyes of the people, leaders are no longer running the country. They are trapped in a closed world, where every failure is dressed in euphemism and every tragedy is denied through official statements. This isn't just a disconnect in understanding, it's a moral divide. And once that moral divide takes shape, every attempt to restore order through force becomes meaningless. More concerning still, this rupture in narrative strips the regime of its last tool for managing crisis. A state can survive through violence if it still retains the capacity to speak, even if that dialogue is performative. But when language becomes self-referential, when it no longer speaks to society at all, power begins to operate in a vacuum. And within that vacuum, every decision becomes more extreme, more reckless. It is that recklessness that now leads Tehran to look not only inward, but outward. When the regime can no longer persuade its own people, when its internal discourse collapses, it must seek its sense of purpose elsewhere, on the battlefield of global confrontation. Threats aimed outward, bold declarations against foreign enemies. These are not only meant to deter the world, they are meant to fill the void of legitimacy at home. And that is the moment when a domestic crisis spills across national borders. When language at home no longer works, power begins to seek survival through international conflict. From this point on, the flames on Tehran's streets are no longer just Iran's problem. They become signals to foreign powers, opening a dangerous strategic window where civil unrest and geopolitics begin to merge. In the world of geopolitics, no power vacuum lasts for long. When a country falls into deep internal crisis, that vacuum immediately becomes a signal, a flashing light for outside eyes. Iran today is not just a society in upheaval. It is a chessboard, opening moves that global powers have long been waiting to play. In Washington, the images of smoke and fire in Tehran aren't viewed emotionally. They're analyzed through strategic spreadsheets. A stable Iran, even as an adversary, is still a predictable entity. But an Iran fractured by domestic unrest, financially drained, and steadily losing legitimacy is a different equation altogether. It's more dangerous, yet also more vulnerable. And in the language of power, that is exactly when old scenarios, once filed away, are quietly pulled back onto the table. The redeployment of naval strike groups, the muscle-flexing military maneuvers, these are no longer just signals of deterrence. They're reminders. The military option never disappeared. It was merely postponed. And Iran, forced to divert resources inward, can no longer project regional deterrence the way it once did. Every security unit drawn into the chaos of Tehran's streets is one less unit guarding the borders, protecting supply lines, or preparing for conflict abroad. Tel Aviv sees this picture through a colder lens. For Israel, time is always existential. An Iran weakened from within presents a rare opportunity to delay or even derail strategic programs long viewed as existential threats. But it's also a double-edged sword. A regime backed into a corner is far more likely to act rashly, to escalate externally in order to redirect internal pressure. That's why the international chessboard surrounding Iran right now isn't one of bold moves. It's a game of tense waiting. Every player is calculating. Will the flames of unrest consume the regime on their own? Will they be extinguished by brute force? Or worse, will they explode into a regional confrontation? No one wants to be the one to strike the match. But no one wants to miss the moment when the strategic door swings open, even just a crack. Meanwhile, the proxy forces Tehran once relied on to expand its influence are showing signs of fatigue. With resources pulled back home, with funding and weapons flows disrupted, that network is losing the agility that once made it formidable. Threats to ignite the region still sound dangerous, but they no longer carry the same weight. They're unsettling, yes, but not enough to make adversaries flinch like before. More importantly, the Iranian people are no longer swayed by the narrative of an external enemy. For decades, inflating the foreign threat helped the regime justify sacrifice and repression. But when the violence now comes from the state's own hand, when foreign fighters appear in the streets, that narrative loses its power. And once it fails domestically, it begins to lose traction internationally as well. From the perspective of global powers, this is a fragile moment. A total Iranian collapse could destabilize the region, spike energy prices, and shake already fragile alliances. But a surviving Iran, limping forward in a prolonged state of weakness, opens the door to a deeper restructuring of Middle Eastern power dynamics. That's why external responses are both firm and cautious, like footsteps across thin ice. Iran's internal unrest is no longer just a domestic issue. It has become a strategic window where every flame on Tehran's streets is viewed through military maps, diplomatic scenarios, and cold cost-benefit calculations. And in that moment, Iran's fate is shaped not only by what happens within its borders, but by how the world outside chooses to respond or chooses not to a regime stretched to the breaking point. Iran now stands at a moment in history, one that few nations are ever granted. And when such a moment arrives, hesitation is no longer a luxury. It's the moment when every path backward begins to close, when choices that once existed in parallel now collide, forcing reality to turn down a road from which there is no return. The flames rising on the streets of Tehran aren't just consuming banks, government buildings, or symbols of power. They're burning away something far deeper and far more dangerous, the fear that has kept this society in a state of quiet endurance for over 4 decades. Once a collective memory registers that what was once thought impossible has already happened, no amount of security can erase that truth. You can clear the streets, you can make mass arrests, you can cut the internet and control the narrative, but you cannot force memory back into silence. On a deeper level, Iran's tragedy lies not only in the clash between state and society, but in the exhaustion of strategic space. A regime severed from its people, dependent on foreign fighters, locked in a feedback loop of self-soothing rhetoric, and scrutinized by international power plays, is a regime with few options left. Each move from here carries greater risk than the last. Each decision could be the catalyst that pushes the crisis beyond the point of control. History shows moments like this rarely end in order. Change may come slowly, it may arrive suddenly, it may unfold through painful reconstruction, or through prolonged chaos. But once the arrows have left the bowstring, no power on earth can call them back. The question is no longer if Iran will change, but who will shape that change, at what cost, and for how long. Caught between flames from within and pressure building just beyond its borders, Iran is walking the thinnest line in modern Middle Eastern history. With each passing day, that line narrows. And in that tense silence, the future is being written, not with speeches, but with choices that offer no way back. If you have your own perspective on what's unfolding in Iran, or a different take on what lies ahead for the Middle East, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep following deep, clear-eyed geopolitical analysis that doesn't shy away from the hard questions, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the videos to come.